Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Information Studies 650 lecture. We'll be looking at legal and ethical issues in archives. So here are our weekly topics. What is copyright? What is fair use? What is the difference between copyright and fair use? How can copyright impact access to archival collections? What ethical standards should archivists be held to and why? And how can archives balance privacy with access? And we'll be looking at all 5 of our course learning objectives for this week. So the legal and ethical issues that we are going to touch on this week, as you can see here and as hinted in the weekly topics, are copyright, privacy, and codes of ethics. And copyright is definitely rooted in the legal side of what we'll be discussing this week. It's a big legal issue that archivists face. And then we have privacy, which in a lot of ways, as we'll discuss later on, is an overlap between a legal and an ethical concern that archivists have to consider. And then we'll also talk about codes of ethics, which, as you might guess, are firmly aligned with the ethical side of our discussion for this week. So we'll start by looking at copyright. So this is a description of copyright from the US Copyright Office. So essentially it's a form of protection for original works of authorship fixed in a tangible medium of expression. And it's important to note that copyright covers both published and unpublished works. So something like a draft would be copyrighted even if it's not officially published, or if a book isn't published, then the author still has copyright for that book. So copyright lasts for quite a long time. The life of the author plus an additional 70 years. So if I were to die today, heaven forbid, any work of art or anything that I had produced would be under the copyright of my estate for the next 70 years. So again, quite a long time. If I write something now and I live for another, 80 years and have a cluster of grandkids around my legs, or I'm sorry, another 40 years, then, anything that I write today would be copyrighted for the next, I think 110 years. So quite a long time. So it's important to note, as Miller does on page 111, the difference between intellectual and physical ownership. So an archive may own a collection. They may have had ownership of a collection signed over to them by the donor, but that doesn't automatically give the archive control over the copyright. Now, certainly possible, and I think it's quite common for archives to request the copyright is transferred over, simply because it just removes some legal issues that the archive has to consider, but it's not automatic. It's something that has to be specified. Otherwise, even if a donor gives the collection away, they still may maintain copyright and still maintain ownership of the intellectual material contained within a play or a photograph or whatever the contents of the records are. So just an interesting little wrinkle there, huh? Okay, so one thing that is really useful for archives in public libraries as well, our brethren in the information studies field, is the concept of fair use. And fair use is defined in section 108 of the US Code. And as the ALA states, essentially gives libraries or archives the right to reproduce, distribute, display, or perform in facsimile, so like a physical copy or digital form, any work in the last 20 years of its copyright term for purposes of preservation, research, or scholarship. So obviously preservation, research, and scholarship are big things that archives and libraries are involved in, so fair use is supportive of that. As Columbia University Libraries notes here, a library or an archive is eligible for section 108 if it's just generally open to the public, if it doesn't charge any kind of membership fee or anything like that, if it allows researchers to come even if they're not affiliated with a specific institution. So there really can't be barriers, financial or some kind of membership between a person accessing a library archive for that library archive to be considered protected by fair use. So there are some additional factors that will be used in determining whether a particular use is fair or not. So the purpose of the use, if you are intending to use copyrighted material in some way that is going to benefit you financially, that's probably not going to be considered fair use because you're profiting off of someone else's work. And that's something that essentially copyright is meant to preserve the ability of a person to profit from their own work. And if you take something that is copyrighted and use it to profit yourself, that's not something that is typically going to be considered fair use. So generally, nonprofit or educational purposes are more applicable to fair use. Next, we have the nature of the copyrighted work. So the works that are factual are more likely to be considered fair use than fictional or just entertaining. It's because factual works are considered to be more likely to spread knowledge and educate people. Not necessarily true all the time, but that's the idea, and thus more in line with the ideals of fair use. Also, published works are more likely to be considered fair use than unpublished works. The thought is that if something is unpublished, then it really ought to be the person who has copyright having the first opportunity to reproduce the work or exhibit a work. So typically, things that are published are more likely to be considered fair use than unpublished. Another interesting factor is the amount of a work that is going to be used. So if you are using an entire chapter of a book that someone has copyright on, that's different than if you're planning on using the entire book for whatever use you're making. So the smaller the percentage of a work that's used, the more likely it is to be considered fair use. And last but not least, the effect of the use on the potential market for or value of the copyrighted work. So if my intended use of a copyrighted work is going to infringe on the ability of an individual to profit from that work later on, then that is something that may prevent my use from being considered a fair use, because what I do is going to impact someone's ability to profit from their copyrighted work. I will say that archivists spend a lot of time wringing their hands and worrying about copyright. It really can impact a lot of access decisions that archivists make, because they feel like, oh, if I put this online, am I going to run into copyright issues? Am I going to get a nasty letter from a lawyer, or what's going to happen? Typically, this is pretty uncommon. As I talked about before, archives and libraries are generally protected under the umbrella of fair use. So there aren't likely to be a whole lot of legal problems for archives when it comes to copyright, as long as they can make sort of reasonable decisions about what to provide access to and how to provide access to it. The worst that they'll probably get is a takedown order, which archives are typically more than happy to follow. So copyright is something that archivists need to be aware of generally, but I don't think it's something that should really impact the accessibility decisions that an archive makes, because the repercussions or the likelihood of significant repercussions is pretty low. Okay, so next we'll move into the nether region between legal and ethical issues and talk about privacy. So there are a few issues that archives have to consider when thinking about privacy as it relates to archives. So one of them is wanting to encourage honest donations, or donations that really reflect an individual's life and haven't been censored into a collection of records that doesn't really resemble the truthful or honest depiction of a person's life and a person's activities. And as we'll talk about later on, concerns about privacy can be something that can lead people to self-censor and not provide archives with that clear and authentic picture of their lives. Another issue that archives have to deal with is identifying private information. So finding some way to determine what information is private and thus should be protected in some way so that people don't suffer a loss of their privacy. And we'll talk about some of the different types of privacy violations in just a little bit. Another issue is balancing access and privacy. So the more you restrict access to records in the name of privacy, the less accessible those records are, and the less available that information is to the general public, which can be good because as archivists we do want to preserve a person's privacy, but it's also bad because that's less information that is available to the public, and it's a diminished picture of a person's life or an organization's activities that the public is able to interact with, which is bad. So there has to be a nice balance between the two. And another issue that archives face is sustainability. So how can archives in a sustainable way engage in a process that is going to identify private information, is going to balance access and privacy, but is also something that archives can do within the framework of the resources that they can bring to bear on identifying privacy issues in collections. So we talked about the bulk of modern collections, how even a person's electronic records can be just thousands and thousands of records. I think I looked the other day and I have like 30,000 photos on my Google Photos. So how are you going to go through all of those to find out if there are any potential privacy issues going on? It's going to be difficult. So archivists have to think about sustainable ways to identify private information and to try and have this balance between access and privacy. And we'll talk about one way that archivists can do that later on in the lecture. So here are those types of privacy violations that I talked about, mentioned in the Hentonen article. So intrusion upon solitude, disclosure of embarrassing facts, false light publicity, and appropriation of name or likeness. A couple of these are probably more likely to occur in archives than others. So the disclosure of embarrassing facts, someone writes in their diary about a love affair that they had, or the fact that I don't know, they wet themselves when they were in 5th grade or something. Those are the things that can cause people to be embarrassed. And, that's something that can certainly occur in archives. Another one is appropriation of name or likeness. So essentially identity theft. If someone has personally identifying information in their collection, like a social security number or something like that, then someone could conceivably access that information and use that to steal their identity. Maybe get some credit cards, go on a nice vacation somewhere, and so on. And so these are obviously things that archives want to avoid happening to archival donors, right? The reason why archives can be such hotbeds of privacy violations is because, as the Hentonen article notes on page 288, archives facilitate the accumulation of information. And the more information is accumulated and the more accessible this information is, that can result in a person's privacy being violated. If you think about it, an archival collection can be kind of one-stop shopping for violating a person's identity, because archivists have taken records about a person and put them in a nice accessible collection or even online records for someone to look at. So there's a lot of opportunity for these types of privacy violations to occur. As Hentonen also notes on page 289, archives transfer knowledge in usable form from one point in time and context to another. And privacy can be impacted if records are used for a purpose not related to their creation. So if I write a letter or a diary entry in, 1995 about this embarrassing thing happened to me, I'm sort of writing that to myself. I'm writing that to remind myself of what happened in my life. And I'm not really thinking about someone using it in the context of researching my life and possibly disclosing this embarrassing fact to other people. So the transformation of the context in which records are being created and used can result in privacy violations taking place. I may not have any idea that my records are going to be in an archive someday, so that's not really the purpose that I have in mind when I'm writing my diary. I'm just trying to, again, have a reminder of things, and I'm not aware that a researcher might access this in 30 years. And so, again, this shifted context can make it more likely for my privacy to potentially be violated in the future. I mentioned online collections before and how those can, and how archives can really facilitate a loss of privacy. And this is something that this Hamer quote talks about on page 176 when she talks about digital heritage materials can really facilitate communication, but they can also be uploaded to the internet, and that allows them to be distributed, circulated and accessed in a very public way. And it's important that archives are really cognizant of that fact, especially when it comes to records related to people who have been marginalized or sort of exploited and disempowered in the past. So Hamer is talking about, because of the role that archives have in condensing and facilitating the access to information, archivists really need to think about how they're doing that and why they're doing that and which records they are making more accessible for researchers to look at. So you could obviously connect this to our third course objective here, describe the practices, social responsibilities, and ethical obligations of archivists. Hamer is saying archivists have the responsibility to balance the needs of parties, to balance privacy and access in a way that is respectful of the cultures and people represented in archival records. You could talk about our fifth course learning objective here. So this facilitated access is done because of the change in the nature of records from records that didn't exist in digital form and couldn't be placed online for instantaneous distribution, circulation, and access. And you could also connect it to evaluate the role that records creators play in the construction of social memory, because as archives digitize things and upload them and make them more accessible and more capable of circulation, that can result in some information being more likely to be used in the construction of social memory as opposed to other types of information. So you can connect this one excerpt from the Hamer article to a few of our course objectives here. Okay, so next we'll talk about some of the privacy strategies that the Henton article talks about. So we have destruction, anonymization, self-management, limitation, and safe haven. And the Henton article talks about these as being different strategies that people might engage in order to preserve their privacy. So it's interesting to think about which of these are best for archives. Are best for the archival goal to provide access to information that is authentic, impartial, and represents the true nature of a person or an organization's activities. And I think that you can make a strong case that destruction, anonymization, and self-management really aren't the best options for archives. Destruction, obviously, the records are gone. They no longer exist. And as the Henton article notes, this may be done without any input by archives. It may take place before records even get into archival custody. Anonymization, the information still exists, but information that's important for contextual purposes may be lost. So the information is still there, but it's kind of a ghost of itself, and it may not have this rich contextual knowledge that, as we've discussed throughout this course, is so important for researchers. Self-management is a little bit better, but anytime you're leaving it up to the subjects of records to sort of act on their own behalf and make these decisions about the level of privacy they want, then that can lead to some complications, especially if they don't really understand how to manage their privacy, which Hentonen mentions as one of the possibilities related to this privacy strategy. So a little bit better is limitation. So this is something that is still determined by the subject of records, and it states that the distribution of information should be determined by the purpose of its creation. So if information was created for a certain purpose, then that really should determine how accessible the information is in the future. And this is actually pretty closely related to the privacy strategy that Bingo mentions in the reading for this week, contextual integrity. And we'll talk about that later on in the lecture. And then we have safe haven, which is honestly the most beneficial one for archives. So this is a situation in which the info is held until public access is possible. It's defined in donor agreements, and this may result in the survival of important information. So the Henton article describes this as kind of a fenced-in garden where the records still exist. They haven't been destroyed. They haven't been anonymized. Information about the records hasn't been destroyed. And it's just a matter of waiting for the right time for this information to be accessible to the broader public, whether it's restricted for 5 years or 10 years. At least there's an understanding that at some point the information will be accessible to the public, and the public will be able to access the information. Another consideration with privacy is third-party privacy rights. So the Hamer and the Bingo articles both mention the term blind donor. And a blind donor is essentially someone who has information represented in archives, but that's done without their consent or even without their knowledge. So for example, if I were to write a letter to you and you responded and our correspondence ended up in an archive, well, you didn't necessarily say, sure, Sean, go ahead and put this into an archive. And people may be reading, facts or things that you disclose in that letter, which may be embarrassing to you and may undermine your privacy. So you would be the blind donor in this instance because you're not really consenting to having your information about your life shared with the public. I may not even be aware of what's in that letter. But it is a situation where people may have private information about themselves represented in an archive again, without really consenting to have that be the case. On page 172, Hamer talks about how web users are blind donors because they may not understand how their data is collected and preserved and captured by governments and private corporations. I'm sure Facebook does all kinds of awful things with our data, Instagram, Twitter. People may be generally aware of it, but I don't think the people can fully grasp exactly what information is preserved and how it's distributed and who gets it and some of the privacy implications related to that. Relatedly, on page 507 in the Bingo article, he cites Nissenbaum, who talks about the aggregation of consumer information gathered online as an example of how information provided in one context is appropriated in new context without the subject's knowledge. So again, this idea of a transformation of context. I may buy a exercise bicycle online, and so I provide that information to, Peloton or BowFlex or whatever. I may not really be aware that the information about what I bought and how I bought it and where it's going might also be used by other people without my knowledge or really without my consent. So again, this transformation of context can be something that can really lead to a loss of privacy and a violation of a person's privacy. So this is something that archives have to be aware of. If we aren't concerned or thinking about how a person's privacy might be violated without their consent, then that seems a little ethically shaky to me. It seems like a situation where archives are maybe allowing one donor to speak to other people that are represented in their collections, potentially without their knowledge. And if I was someone and I wrote an intimate letter to another person, I would not necessarily want that to be in an archive someday. So that can certainly be problematic. So again, looking at these privacy strategies, it is important that archives think about privacy and how privacy concerns can impact which privacy strategy records creators prefer or want to adhere to. So if we just kind of ignore privacy concerns, then it may lead to records creators and donors engaging in these privacy strategies that result in a loss of information and a decrease in the value of collections that are available for archivists and for researchers in the future. So it's really important that we think about what kind of possible violations of privacy can occur, and that we engage in different processes to try and root out any privacy issues that might be involved or present in collections. So that's where this idea of contextual integrity that the Bingo article touches on, or it doesn't touch on, discusses quite thoroughly. That's where this idea comes in, because Bingo identifies contextual integrity as a way to discover any privacy concerns that may be present in archival collections. So contextual integrity is focused on identifying different functions and different contexts that records are created under, and using that determination to decide whether or not a record may possibly have privacy concerns associated with it. So it certainly can involve an interaction with the donor, working with a donor to determine if the donor was in a position that could involve private communication, if the records are related to a close relationship that the donor had, how any private information might have been shared, and this can help discover some of the blind donors that we talked about. If I say, well, I did write these letters to my friend and these are in my collection, then that would cause the archivist to say, okay, it looks like there might be a privacy risk here, so let's take a look at those records. Contextual integrity also seeks to identify some of the factors that can bear upon the sensitivity of the record, such as the nature of the relationship between two people and the context in which records were created. So if I'm writing letters to my wife, that's probably correspondence that's going to be fairly intimate. If I'm writing correspondence to, I don't know, like my neighbor or someone like that, there's probably less of a likelihood that it's going to contain information that might be considered private. So the desire here is to avoid having to navigate privacy issues item by item, because again, that goes back to the idea of sustainability. If you're trying to do this for every record in a collection, you're not going to have the resources to do that. So again, the idea is that you attempt to identify collection or types of collections, types of records within a collection that may be more likely to contain privacy issues or private information, and just look at those instead of looking at the entire collection. So it's kind of a way to separate the wheat from the chaff a little bit and focus on particular parts of the collection and not all of it. As I have noted in this diagram here, contextual integrity is focused on the idea of risk and reward. So if a collection has materials that are likely private and have low research value, then you might say, okay, it's not really worth privacy issues for us to accept this collection or to accept this part of collection. If records document an important function or a function that has high research value, then you may be more willing to tolerate the possibility of some private information being contained in those records, simply because the records are, at least from your understanding, more likely to be valuable and more likely to document an important part of a person's life. So there are a lot of overlaps between contextual integrity and appraisal. Essentially, contextual integrity is a way to identify during the appraisal process possible privacy issues that are going on. And it's not the case that contextual integrity needs to necessarily take place before appraisal occurs. It could be after the records are brought into the archive, and as you're processing the records or looking at them more closely, you may start to think about which records you want to look at more closely for possible privacy issues. Ideally, you'll be proactive and identify these possibilities before you acquire the records, because why do you want to bring records into your archive and spend time going through them if you're not actually going to include them in the final sort of collection of records that you give to researchers? But it doesn't necessarily have to be done before appraisal is made. It may be something that you do to determine what kind of access you're going to provide after the records have been accepted. So, as I mentioned, if records document an important function, if they have a high research value, you may provide wide access to them, even if there is some private information possibly present in those records. So it's just kind of a balancing act and trying to identify which records may be private and really focusing your time and your decision making on determining whether to bring those records into your archive, and if so, what kind of private or what kind of access to provide to them. So as the Bingo article notes, privacy is in this sort of gray area between a legal consideration and an ethical argument. Bingo cites the Society of American Archivists Code of Ethics, which states that archivists have to be aware of and safeguard the privacy of individuals. But again, it's unlikely that archives are going to be held legally liable for violating privacy. If someone can prove that archives sort of maliciously provided access to information, that's one thing. But generally speaking, archives have a pretty low legal risk. But there still is a strong ethical argument made for protecting the privacy of individuals, because again, not only is it just the decent thing to do, but if people feel like their privacy is going to be disregarded or not considered by archives, then that may make them less likely to donate records to archives, or less likely that they're going to donate records to archives that have been sort of self-censored and all the good stuff taken out. And honestly, it's the good stuff that provides so much importance of a collection, right? And so if archives lose that, then they really are losing, you know, kind of the heart and soul of a collection. Another important thing to consider with contextual integrity is sometimes you have to provide access to private information if it's in the public good. And that's something that Mingo touches on, is something that contextual integrity doesn't really consider all that well. So something may violate a person's privacy, but if there's sort of the greater good of society that can be gained from this loss of privacy, then that's something that archivists should consider as well. They may have an ethical obligation to violate a person's privacy because doing that can support some goal or support the well-being of society. So, you know, like whistleblowers, they violate a person's privacy, but with the idea that by doing so, they are holding someone accountable or preventing something bad from happening in the future. So again, it's interesting to think of privacy as being kind of in the gray zone of legal considerations and ethical arguments. Okay, so next we'll talk about ethical framework. So shifting to our discussion of ethics, here are the things in the Miller article that that Miller feels should be represented in ethical frameworks, or things ethical frameworks should address. The Hamer article talks about how there's a need to update them due to digital access, and she really considers codes of ethics to be by and large weak. So she quotes Richard Cox, who says, you know, honestly, it's mostly up to archivists to make ethical decisions themselves, and code of ethics don't really impact a person's decisions. But it's interesting to look at some of these different things that Miller has listed and talk about them a little bit more. So respect for human rights. You know, is governmental accountability and transparency a human right? Do archivists have an ethical obligation to advocate for stronger public record laws? This is something that Hamer discusses on page 169. If you say yes, archivists do have an obligation to hold the government more accountable and to advocate for more access to records, then that's something that an archivist should do. Another interesting one to think about is what we talked about before, is it a human right for groups to determine access conditions for their records? So if I'm a part of a marginalized group, do I have the human right to determine who accesses records related to my community and what that access looks like? You know, is that something that archivists should consider to be an ethical consideration and something that an ethical code should cover as well? Something else that the Miller list here mentions is transparency, and that's something that Hamer talks about as well. On page 158, Hamer talks about how archives conduct processes that shape social legacy, but they do so largely within the shadows, and that there is a need for archives to document context-driven decisions made about actions related to the records. And she talks about, especially with digital records, archivists are making these decisions more frequently about what to collect, how to provide access to it, which aspects of the record to maintain into the future. So the frequency and volume of these decisions has really been sort of accelerated and compounded over time. And again, this is a reflection of a shift in the nature of records to digital records and the increased access to those records and the increasing questions about how to preserve them that archives are faced with. So the need for transparency has been emphasized and really increased by the shift to electronic records. And we've talked about transparency a lot in this class, about how archives should be transparent about appraisal decisions that they make, about how they should be transparent about which records they select for digitization, how they preserve records. So I really feel like there is a strong place for transparency in archival codes of ethics. So the reason why codes of ethics might be helpful is because they can improve or increase the trust in archives. And similar to respecting privacy, this can result in a reluctance by potential donors to archives to censor themselves. And this is something that the Henston article notes on page 290. So if a person's privacy isn't considered, then there is the danger of records donated to archives not giving an undistorted view of society and the conditions in which they were created. And I feel like you can connect this to codes of ethics as well. If the public sees that archives have agreed to a code of ethics, and that code of ethics, corresponds with values that they have and that society has, then that can improve the trust that donors have in archives and improve the trustworthiness of archives. And if you trust someone, if you trust a profession, then you're more likely to provide them with information that isn't censored and hasn't had all the fun and interesting and rich detail removed from it, because you're worried that, oh, the archivists are going to violate my privacy, or they're going to provide access to information that I don't want accessible, at least not right now. So codes of ethics may not necessarily shape an archivist's behavior to a great extent, but they may shape the behavior of the public. If we can at least make the public think that we're behaving ethically, even if we may not necessarily be shaped by codes of ethics, then that can still be beneficial because it can improve this trust in archives. So this is another excerpt from the Hamer article where she talks about codes of ethics and how they place the archivist as an agent in the life cycle of the record, an agent that makes decisions about how things are selected, acquired, described, and so on. And it's important that archivists are transparent about these different decisions that we make, again, because that can provide more information about what archives do, how we do it, and sort of take archives out of the shadowy realm that people may not understand, and just provide more insight into what archivists do and how they do it. And again, I feel like that's something that can be really beneficial to people having trust in archives and wanting to donate the unvarnished truth to archives. So again, you can connect this to our third course objective here, also to our first course objective, because again, I feel people, if archivists are more transparent, then that can result in information surviving to be brought into archives and thus available for researchers. And Hamer does talk about the era of digital records, so you can attach that to our fifth course objective as well when you're talking about a shift in the nature of records. Okay, so we'll wrap up by looking at creatorship in archives. So there are a few connections here between legal and ethical issues and how they can shape the ultimate collection of information that a researcher has to work with. So obviously, big one is creation by archivists. The decisions that archivists make about how well they protect a person's privacy, how well they balance privacy and access can determine what information a researcher has to look at in the future. If archivists are just all access, then a researcher may have more information to work with and sort of a richer selection of records to work with. But that may come at the cost of archives being seen as untrustworthy and may lead donors to be reluctant to donate records to archives at all, or may lead to them censoring their records before they send them to an archival repository. So those can be pretty fundamental acts that archives can engage in, which have some creative role in shaping archival collections. Creation by communities is an interesting one. It may be that communities have certain cultural standards or cultural influences that determine how records should be accessed and who they should be accessed by. And if an archives honor those, that can certainly shape the collection of records that researchers have to work with. So that would be an example of curatorship by the community, sort of having an influence on the ultimate composition of an archival collection. And also creation by the individual. So again, if an individual feels like archives are adhering to ethical standards and protecting privacy, then that may lead them to provide more of an unvarnished view of their life to archives and have, you know, the juicy stuff still represented in archival records. So that would be another example of how legal and ethical considerations or issues can impact what a researcher ultimately has to work with and interact with. Okay, so that was kind of a barnstorm through legal and ethical issues. I think the readings for this week are some of the more interesting ones in this course, so I hope that you enjoyed reading them, especially the bingo article. I think is really interesting, some of the examples that the author gives about what contextual integrity is and how it can be used. And I definitely hope you see the overlaps between that and appraisal, because there is a lot of overlap there. And I love reading and talking about appraisal, so that's maybe another reason why I like that article so much. But yeah, I hope that you enjoyed the lecture and enjoyed the readings for this week, and please let me know if you have any questions.